When you're learning the Portuguese language, how can you tell whether a word is masculine or feminine? That's a big question I've had for a long time. Is there a way to predict based on the morphology, the spelling, or the sound of a word and say, yeah, I know that that's definitely a feminine or that's definitely a masculine word? I had a theory that the suffix, the last few letters of the word, can give us some insight onto that. So I went on USP's website and I was able to find a corpus of the Portuguese language. Now, this lexicon is not perfect, and I had to make a lot of edits for very obvious mistakes. But that's the thing about data science is that you can't just not do it because the data is not perfect. So this graph might look better in the future, but for now it gives us a rough estimate as to what the suffixes of these words can tell us. And so by doing data analysis on the entire corpus available from USP, it's explained in a paper that I'll link below, we can see that this graph is huge. Oh my God, look at all these suffixes. It's not possible to talk about all this. So something called the 80-20 rule, right? Pareto, or whatever you want to call it, says that 80% of the data is explained by 20% of the data categories. That means if I only want to get the 95% most commonly occurring suffixes, the graph goes from this down to a very manageable size. So we can see in this graph these different suffixes, which I've kind of selected by hand to tell us if they are more commonly feminine or more commonly masculine. As you can see on one side of the graph, we have dade, agem, ose, são, and just a, as well as esse starts to get a little bit more masculine. These ones are almost always feminine, with a few exceptions, which I will list at the end of the video. Now on the other side of the graph, we can see the very masculine suffixes. Whether it ends in ao or just any L, that's probably going to be very masculine. If it ends in o or or, im, ar, u, n, que, I, or even a tonic a instead of just a non-tonic a. These are very, very masculine words with very few exceptions. It's not until we get to the middle of the graph that we see that, unfortunately, for a lot of these words, there's just no way other than memorizing the exceptions. Those would be the words that end in E, being the most consistently switching ones, although they do have a tendency to be male, or masculine rather. And if you were to guess that they were masculine, you would have a higher probability of guessing that. That doesn't mean that the words that are feminine that end in E do not show up more often. See, this data set does not take into account frequency of use in the language. That would be a very big upgrade to this study. And if anyone would like to do so, I'll do my best to try to make this code available for you so that you can tinker around with this data and this Jupyter notebook as well. The ending in ma, I thought would be very masculine, and it is, but it turns out it's not super masculine because there's a lot of Greek words that end in ma, like o sistema, o problema, right? Which these words are masculine because of Greek, even though they end in a. So you have to separate the ones that end in ma versus the ones that don't end in ma but still end in a, right? This is the same thing with são versus the words that end in o. So if a word ends in são, almost always it's going to be feminine. That's either with C cedilha, or with double S, right? SS, ão. It's much more common for the C cedilha words to be feminine versus the são ones because sometimes those are augmentative or not. So let's go through and look at some of these common exceptions so that you and I can understand which words are breaking the rules more often than others. Starting from the feminine side of the graph over to the masculine, we have dade. You will never find a masculine word dade. And if you do know of one that ends in dade, then please comment it below so that we can improve this lexicon. Because the whole point of data science is to understand how we can get better data, which better represents the real world. Because at the end of the day, data is just an inaccurate and incomplete representation of reality. This can always change. Language is fluid. All right. Agem has the same story. You can use words like o personagem, right? O personagem would be an example of using something that's grammatically feminine in a masculine way to talk about a specific gender of a person. There's a difference between using personal gender with a word versus using grammatical gender. So here we're just going to talk about grammatical gender, okay? Ozzy as a Finnish, right? Virose is always going to be feminine, except for this one word, klosi, which comes from English, it seems like, and it's actually a word that's used in Pajubá, which I've made videos before about Pajubá. A klosi is a pose. Dar close. Dar close. Not uma close, close. That's the only exception. As we get down to são with cedilha, we see that we have beição, cabeção, cachação, calção, carroção, cação, contrapunção, coração, estremeção, loção, pescoção, tição, and tropeção. These words are all masculine. Outside of these words, if you see something ending in são, then it is feminine, right? And that's really good to know because we talk about o coração very often. And the reason is because some words have a cedilha, but the is actually an augmentative. So we are making it bigger. Beiço, beição, right? For the words that end in a that are masculine, statistically, there's a very small percentage, but because there's so many words that end in a in Portuguese, the list is actually way too long. So I'm just going to scroll it here and you can read it yourself. It's similar for são, but what we have is arremessão, artesão, ação, bisão, blusão, bolsão, brasão, busão. Is there twice? No, I think I misread it. Anyways, camisão, casão, cortesão, diapasão, fazão, frisão, ganção, gostosão, right? Gostosão, that's a good one to learn. Salsão, sanção, são, as a word, like saint. Tesão, that's a good one to learn. Toção, and travessão. So, anything that ends in são, you're going to expect it to be feminine, except for these words I just said. You'll say o travessão, o tosão, o tesão, just like that. Once we get to isi, we see that it's also very feminine, but it has a few exceptions, like alcoice, apêndice. I can't do vogal fechado and aberto, so please leave comments if I said it good or if I said it bad. Which words do I need to improve on for my vogais abertos e fechados? Apêndice, coice, cálice, caudice, códice, córtice, frútice, fórnice, mesoapêndice, pontífice, sílice, turbohélice, vértice, vórtice, ápice, índice, óbice. And we can see that these words are esdrúxula. Esdrúxula, I think that's the word for it. It's when the accent is on the, not the second to last, but the third to last, the penultimate. So there seems to be a pattern when the accent is on that ending word, it seems like it becomes masculine instead of feminine. Must have something to do with Greek or Latin or something, but I'm not going to get too deep into it because we got a lot to get through. Once you get to E, you can see there's almost a 50-50 split between masculine and feminine. It's most of the time masculine, but these are all the feminine words you have to take into account. So maybe it's not worth studying this one. Maybe you just got to kind of learn it over some time. Ma is kind of a similar story. You would expect that o sistema, o problema, these are always going to be masculine, but then you have things like a plataforma, because this forma, even though it ends in ma, it's not really a Greek word. Ente, we start to get to the masculine biases. Ente, we have a aguardente, a avoante, a bacante, a chiante, a concedente, a contracorrente, a contangente, a debutante, a dirimente, a enchente, a evolvente, a fonte, a frente, a fronte, a gente, a jussante, a lente, a mente, a ponte, a semente, a semiserpente, também serpente, né? A submediente, a subcorrente, a subdominante, a subtangente, a superdominante e a torrente. That was a lot of them. Those are all feminine. But if you see NTE as a suffix, it's probably going to be masculine if it's not one of those words. Let's continue. Eti. A caminhonete with an alternative spelling, right? A chacrete, a charrete, a claquete, a diabete, right? Can also be o diabete, like I said before. A enquete, a garçonete, a gilete, a lanchonete, a manchete, a maquete, a marionete, a omelete, a kitnete, a raquete, a submanchete, a vagonete, a vedete. These are all feminine words. If you see etchi outside of these words, not saying the corpus is perfect, there might be other examples, it's going to be masculine. Now we move to on. On is one which has so many examples because there's so many. So even though the percentage on the graph is small, it says no, most of the time it's masculine. It's very uncommon to have feminine words. There's actually a lot because this is a common suffix. So I'm not going to read all of them, but some of them might include a paixão, a conexão, a congestão. But outside of these on the list, which I will scroll through on the screen again for you to see, it's quite a lot to see. They're most of the time going to be masculine because it's an aumentative suffix. O portão, right? A porta, o portão. It's not necessarily the aumentative version. It used to be, but it became its own word. Same with o cartão. A carta, o cartão. They mean separate things, and it's a masculine word now. The endings with a. These seem to be a lot of palavras indígenas. These are indigenous words. Not all of them. Some of them are from other languages, but most of them do not seem to be pure Latin-based Portuguese words. A alia, right? This would be the Jewish going back to the homeland of Israel. Al hukaba, a amanã, a andacá, a anhã, arapuã, aratawa, a boicá, a boicorá, a carandá, a caraná, a crumatá, a cruá, a Iemanjá. Oh, speaking of Iemanjá, I got this for my poster. This is gonna go on my wall behind me. Paz, amor, e Iemanjá. Very important to learn who Iemanjá is for the Brazilian New Year celebrations. We'll put her behind. Where were we? A jacarateá, a jará, a maricá, a pá, a tracuá e a xajá. I don't know what most of these words mean, so if you want to explain some of them in the comments, please let us know. All of us Portuguese learners are dying to figure it out. But if you see a word that ends in a, tônica, it's probably going to be masculine if it's not one of these words. Now, the ones that end in e, or I if you're speaking English, these are going to be masculine, just like the rest of them that I'm going to say, unless it is a bijuri, a devi, a grei, or grei, a jati, a juriti, a juruti, a lei. A lei is very important to know that one. That one comes up a lot, the law. A manduri, a marani, a hani, a hani, a subahaji, a vakapari. I might have not put the accent correctly. I'm not pronouncing these correctly, perhaps, but I just want to show you which words they are. And now we move on to N. We have queen, van, ombudswoman. These are going to be masculine except for these foreign impressed words. We get down to ao. We have acal, a central, a saturnal, a semivogal e a subnormal. We have a colher e a mulher. The rest of them are masculine. We have, for ar, we have a preamar. For in, we have a mandurim. For or, we have a cor, a flor e a sor, which is a name for a freira, an old word that is a cognate of the English word sister. And the last category is o, the ones which we assume are masculine. There really are very, very few words that end in o that are actually feminine. It's much more common for the words to end in a be masculine than it is for the words that end in o to be feminine. So I'm going to read you the short list. We have a expo, we have a Gestapo, a imago, a libido, a linotipo, if you want a different accent, a monofoto, a fotografia, that's why, a prognatismo, a pseudoimago, a radiofoto, a salgueiro, a subtribo, a telefoto e também a tribo, right? And for the ones that end in L, which are not ao, like we said, cow, these are always masculine. So that represents 95% of the data. As you saw in the larger graph, there are many more suffixes which have very few words in the lexicon. And so when I just looked at 95% of the data, the most represented suffixes, this is the condensed graph we have. And I think it was a lot to take in. I hope that this was a fun video to watch. And if you have any more questions about future things that I can go deeper into this, questions that we can ask the data, we don't have to live in darkness. The beauty about this age of a lot of data is that if you know how to manipulate the data, you can answer your own questions. You don't have to sit around and wonder. So I hope you enjoyed this video of combining linguistics with data science to answer some interesting questions about Portuguese words and their genders. Tchau, valeu, falou.